Hello, my name is Dr. Sarah Demelo.
My name is Gisselle Giron.
And we're the curators of a university art collection in the making here at Art Exchange at the University of Essex, Colchester campus. Artwork came to the University of Essex before we even opened our doors to students in 1964. For the founding Vice-Chancellor, Professor Albert Sloman, the accessibility of arts was part of the lifelong journey of education. A university art collection in the making is born out of research into the founding of our university art collection. And it was years of sort of going through the archives here at the Albert Sloman Library on campus to find the origins. We knew that it was Jim Eade, who was the founder of Kettle's Yard, that had the initial donation in 1964, but we wanted to find the reasons why. And it was really likely that Jim Eade heard our founding Vice-Chancellor, Albert Sloman. It was his founding vision set out in the 1963 Wreath Lectures and really felt an affinity to him. Eade at the time was slowly sort of setting up Kettle's Yard in Cambridge, a beautiful house that was full of artworks that was really for the students at the University of Cambridge to come and enjoy. He opened the doors to the students. So between the two men, between Eade and Sloman, there really was this belief in the transformational role that artworks could play in teaching, in research, and in the fulfillment of lives.
We are so lucky to have Alfred Wallace's paintings as part of this show. They were part of Jim Eade's first donation of artworks to the university in 1964. Alfred Wallace was a sailor, a scrap merchant, and a fisherman born in Devonport who developed most of his life and his career both in sand dives and Penzance in Cornwall. He would take a painting in his 70s after he was widowed, and he took it as a form of companionship. His paintings were very much characterized by his life living really close to the sea and living in intimate relationship with the sea. His paintings would also be characterized by using materials which were really close to him. And actually lots of neighbors would usually give him painting or scrap pieces of cardboard for him to continue his paintings. And you can see this in some of the artworks that we have in the show. For example, in this one, you can see that the cardboard has been completely ripped away, and he doesn't hide away from that fact. He would also even use boat paint in his depictions of ships, where he would look for that literalness in his work. In 1928, British modern artists Ben Nicholson and Christopher Wood took one trip to Cornwall, and whilst they were working in the harbour of St. Ives, they stumbled upon Alfred Wallace's work. They were not only surprised by his prolificness, given that his whole house was covered in his paintings, they were particularly moved by his authenticity in committing and expressing those experiences of living in Cornwall in his painting. Particularly for Christopher Wood, he was very interested in his techniques of painting directly onto the surface rather than mixing on a palette. And Ben Nicholson was really impressed with the way that he would translate the authentic or real lifestyle of a sailor. For him, he would later on say about Alfred Wallace that his work was not about the representation of the sea, but the real life at sea. In 1928, after meeting Alfred Wallace alongside Ben Nicholson in Cornwall, Christopher Wood would commit himself to being almost like a pupil of Alfred Wallace and would stay with him for many months. This painting over here, Harbour in the Hills, is very much witness to the mentorship and admiration that Christopher Wood had for Alfred Wallace's work. As you can see, not only Christopher Wood has appropriated the subject matter of Alfred Wallace's paintings, and in this case depicting a harbour scene in Cornwall, but he has also appropriated and emulated the painting technique developed by Alfred Wallace. So it would usually be the case that Christopher Wood, in other paintings, he would mix in his palette rather than the actual surface. And over here, you can see him mixing the cerulean grays and the whites in the waves. And actually, it allows us to see more movement and this very much energetic characterization of the seas, of the ship almost fighting against the ocean waves. And that just makes it a very interesting interpretation of Alfred Wallace's work. After Christopher Wood very much became an admirer of Alfred Wallace, alongside Ben Nicholson, they would come back to London and tell Jim Eade. And Jim Eade himself would also become a supporter and would champion Alfred Wallace's work. And that's how that relationship came about. And now we have part of the works that elucidate into that fantastic episode in English modern art.
So prior to his trip to Cornwall in 1928, Christopher Wood spent quite a lot of time in Paris, where he hung out with the avant-garde, with notable artists like Pablo Picasso and authors like Jean Cocteau. He initially trained as an architect, but that didn't really suit him. So he wanted to become an artist. And so that's why he went to Paris, to learn about the avant-garde and to sort of become fully immersed in the lifestyle in Paris. One of the paintings from the time, which is actually after his trip to Cornwall in 1928, is this one here, Mademoiselle Bourgoin. This was painted in 1929. It's part of a set, really, of Jean and Jeanne Bourgoin, who were siblings. The painting of Jean now lives on in Kettle's Yard, but we have the sibling here at the University of Essex, which again was part of Jim Eade's initial donation in 1964. And you can see there is a real marked difference between, say, Harbour in the Hills from 1928 and this painting here from 1929. The surface is a lot smoother. There's a lot more sort of really care, and there's a lot more of a sense of intimacy, really, with the portrait. It's because Wood had a really sort of fraught relationship, romantic relationship, really, with Jeanne. And you can see that really reflected in the care and the consideration he takes to her face, to the chair she's sitting in, but also marking out and sort of really blacking out her outfit as a complete matte surface so that it doesn't distract from her face and from the care and sort of consideration that he's given. And alongside that, on display, we have this book here, and that is an editor's proof of Jean Cocteau's Les Enfants Terribles from 1929, so the same year that he painted Jeanne's portrait. Now, what's interesting about this is that Jeanne and Jeanne, the siblings that Christopher Wood painted, were the inspiration for the siblings Paul and Elizabeth that feature in Les Enfants Terribles. And in that book, the two siblings, Paul and Elizabeth, really have a very strange and very bizarre relationship. They withdraw themselves from society and they became more and more sort of entwined with each other. And what marks this is different. Why we have this book on display is because this was Christopher Wood's copy of the book that was given to him by Jean Cocteau, and it's actually inscribed in the front, "To my dear friend Kit, love, Jean," with his trademark star that Jean Cocteau would sign books with. Part of this exhibition includes a lot of archival correspondence between Jim Eade and the University of Essex, in particular the Vice-Chancellor, Albert Sloman. And what's interesting about the correspondence, which runs really from 1963 up until 1977, is that it really shows the depth of the friendship between Eade and with Essex, and the sincerity between sort of Sloman and Eade themselves. The way they write to each other, updating one another on their lives. Eade writes to Sloman after the death of his wife Helen in 1977. But also it shows the affinity that they had for each other in their beliefs, in what Sloman was doing here at the University of Essex, alongside that, what Eade was doing at Kettle's Yard in Cambridge. And you can see how the relationship builds up through not just the initial donation in 1964, but with subsequent donations throughout the years. the letters of Henry Gaudier Breshka and his partner Sophie Breshka, the donation of books like the Jean Cocteau. And one letter in particular that really struck us is this one here from May 24th, 1968, where Ede writes to Sloman, and he talks about hearing Sloman sort of on the radio previous, talking about the infamous student protests that happened here in 1968. But what's really interesting is sort of this particular line. Had I been 15 or 10 years younger, I could have come to you and set up a kettle's yard in your midst. Through this affinity between the two men, perhaps there was some proposal early on that dates back to the original 1964 proposal and donation that perhaps Ede was thinking of donating more artworks to the University of Essex. Perhaps we could have had our own kettle's yard here at the University of Essex.
Henry Gaudier Breshka was a French artist, a sculptor and draftsman who had a very prolific career, mostly developed in England. He would join the French army in 1914 and died in action in 1915. Even though he only lived until the age of 23, he became a fundamental piece in the development of British modern art. G. Mead would come to know his artwork whilst working at Tate, and he would fight and do everything in his power to champion his artwork in England. In 1927, he used a third of his annual income to buy all his estate. And we are so lucky at the University of Essex that G. Mead donated a part of Henry Gaudier Breshka's artwork, including his letters. And the letters which Gaudier Breshka wrote to Sophie, his partner who he met in Paris and who would end up taking as part of his hyphenated surname, are part of this show. And they very much not only show part of the intense relationship between Sophie and Henry, but they also show and give glimpses of Henry Gaudier Breshka's own interest in sculpture, and particularly his drive and intentional fascination with movement. In this letter, for example, he tells Sophie about a time when he visited a wrestling match, and he would foretell and he would notify very, very carefully all the movement of the wrestlers. He was particularly fascinated with one episode in which a wrestler would swing around the other one and the other one would just stand up as if nothing had happened. But the way that he describes movement very much informed British modern art movements, particularly the vortices, who were very much enchanted with the idea of how to translate rapid movement in a sculpture, in a static mode. And you can see that as well, very much impressed in some of his drawings. For example, in this one, this is just a regular scene in Chiswick in London, but you can see how he has even depicted the movement in the poplars through his rapid use of a sketch. We are very fortunate to have Henry Gaudier Breshka letters in our collection, not only because they're a magnificent testament to Henry Gaudier Breshka's own personal life and his own interest in the sculptural methods that he was developing and innovating in the early 20th century, but also because they would be the basis to the memoir G. Mead would write about the artist, which would be known under the title of Savage Messiah. And this document was very important in the development of the studies of British modern art. So Albert Sloman's visions to build a collection of pictures that would start what would end up becoming the University Art Collection was really only possible not only thanks to G. Mead's very generous donations, but also through the endeavor, motivation, and work of staff and students at the University of Essex. It was very clear on the early years that even though the School of Creative Arts did not materialize as part of the University of Essex curriculum plans, what did happen was that still the arts was part of a central focus and student-driven endeavor to make sure that the arts was always part of campus life. So, for example, in the early years, the Student Affairs Committee of the Senate would have been given a special allocated budget to purchase works of art. And this is the case of the committee in 1970, which decided to buy with that small budget of £240 a series of etchings by Francisco de Goya. These very much famed engravings by Goya are part of Los Caprichos, which are his first engraving series. And whilst we don't have the original etchings, we have etching reworked a century later, but with the original plates. And this was very fundamental piece, not only in making sure that we grow our collection of pictures, but also used very much in teaching at the time in the Department of Art. This drive to use art objects within teaching and to make sure that students had a physical and real contact with the artwork was very much promoted not only by Albert Sloman, but also by different teachers at the Department of Art. For example, Don Ades, a pioneering scholar in Latin American art, would promote the acquisition and the use of different Latin American artworks within her classes. And such is the case of these wonderful liner cuts by Taller de Gráfica Popular, a Mexican art collective, which was very important from 1937 onwards and is still even active nowadays, which promoted the ideals of the Mexican Revolution. Out of the teaching and research conducted by different pioneering figures such as Don Ades and Valerie Fraser, there will later be developed a small movement to create a collection of art from Latin America, which finally took place in 1993, which opened up the doors to donations and to different acquisitions being conducted under a new art collection, the Essex Collection of Art from Latin America, now known as Scala, which actually now these artworks will belong part of that specific collection. And that's to say that without different students and staff, the original vision of Albert Sloman of building a collection of pictures would not have developed and would not have been part of the rich cultural life that our students and staff are part of at this university.
Over the course of research into the founding of the University Art Collections, and indeed sort of with the rest of art and special collections here on campus, we recognize that the majority of the artists included in the collections are white male voices. And we're striving in the future to really diversify the voices that are included in these collections.
We are working alongside staff and students to create new acquisition policies for current and future projects, such as the development of an LGBTQ+ archive, which will see the work of our university art collections, special collections, and Scala together to diversify our collections.